You are 26 years old, standing on the flight line at McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita, Kansas, and the date is October 3rd, 1966. Avgas runs 31 cents a gallon on base, and your dress blues cost you 2 weeks of flight pay. You have logged 900 hours in the F-105 Thunderchief, a fighter bomber so big and so fast the other pilots call it the Thud, half insult, half prayer. Your fiancée Carol teaches 3rd grade in town, and every Sunday she drives out to the fence line at the end of the runway just to watch you fly the pattern, because she says an airplane sounds different when you're the one flying it. You have ordinary plans. Finish your instructor tour. Marry Carol in the spring. Buy the little house on Maple with the crooked porch. Nothing heroic. Nothing complicated. 18 months ago, on the other side of the world, the United States began a bombing campaign called Rolling Thunder, and it has been eating F-105s at a rate the Air Force does not put in the newspapers. You do not know that number yet. Tonight in base housing, your orders arrive in a manila envelope, and inside it is a single word that rearranges your whole life. Takhli. Watch the Sams, son. 4 words are the whole speech your father gives you when he reads the orders standing in the kitchen. It is the most he has told you about his own war since you were old enough to ask. 25 missions over Germany in a B-17, and a Purple Heart he has never once shown you the scar for. Your mother stands at the stove and stirs a pot that does not need stirring, around and around, long after the soup is done. Your kid sister Denise, 17, asks what a SAM is, and nobody answers her, because nobody at that table wants to say the word missile out loud in a kitchen that smells like Sunday dinner. Carol does not cry. She drives out to your apartment that night, and she does not say she's scared, and she does not say don't go, because both of you know there is no version of this where you don't go. 5 words instead, standing in your doorway with her coat still on. Keep the last dance. You do not fully understand it yet. You will. Loading your bag into the car the night before you leave, you do not expect your father to shake your hand, and he doesn't. He reaches into his coat pocket instead and puts something small and cold into yours, closing your fingers around it before you can look. A silver $50, 1943, with a nick filed into the eagle's wing. He carried it on all 25 missions over Germany, he says, and it came back every time. That's it. That's the whole story he has ever told you about his war, delivered in 11 words in a Kansas parking lot. You put the coin in your left breast pocket, over your heart, and your father nods once and looks at the tail lights of a car that isn't there. That is how men in your family say goodbye. Heat hits you first at Takhli Air Force Base, the way a wall of wet air hits a man stepping off an air-conditioned jet. Because that is exactly what it is. Jet fuel, rice paddy, something frying you will never identify. Your squadron mates are career officers with young faces stretched over something that has already seen more than it should have. That is where you meet Major Hollis Beckett, callsign Preacher, F-86 in Korea, 90 Thud missions stacked up like cordwood before your boots ever touch Thailand. He walks the tarmac at 4 a.m. talking to the jets like they can hear him, patting a wing like another man would pat a horse. In his flight suit, he carries a laminated card with the frequencies for every SAR beacon in North Vietnam, memorized so completely the card is really just for luck. You ask him once what gets a man through 100 missions. He tells you the whole philosophy of his war in 6 words. Fly the airplane, not the fear. First Lieutenant Danny Vokes is your wingman, 24, from a logging town in Oregon. Every off-hour finds him at a workbench in the hangar, carving, not models, a rocking chair, 1 spindle at a time, shipped home piece by piece to a wife 7 months pregnant with a son he has never met. A chisel rides wrapped in an oil rag in his G-suit pocket, a habit the flight surgeon has stopped commenting on. He names the boy out loud on the walk to the jets, like saying it enough times will make the boy arrive into a world with his father still in it. Some men carry a rabbit's foot. Danny carries a chisel and a name. Your first mission into Route Pack 6 comes on your 9th day in country, Hanoi's front porch, the most heavily defended patch of sky in the history of aerial warfare. A briefing officer has drawn SAM rings on the map until the whole target area looks like a target. 40 miles out, the radar warning gear starts singing, a rising tone every Thud pilot learns to fear before anything else in the war. A SAM leaves the ground like a flying telephone pole trailing fire. Preacher's voice comes over the radio flat as a man reading a grocery list. Brake right, brake down, Don't lose it in the sun. You do exactly what he says with your body before your mind catches up, and the missile goes off close enough to rattle the canopy. Back at Takhli that night, your hands will not hold a coffee cup steady. Preacher finds you on the tarmac. He does not tell you it will get easier. He says the 6 words again, slower, like medicine. Fly the airplane, not the fear. You say it back to him. The words are a lie and they work anyway. On Mission 14, your flight lead is a major named Torres you have known for 11 days. Thud Ridge slides by beneath you, green and quiet. The checkpoint every Hanoi-bound strike package uses to turn in toward the target. Right up until the flak opens up without warning from a ridge nobody flagged in the brief. It lasts under a minute. It costs a life that took 31 years to build. Torres's jet takes a hit in the fuel cell and does not explode so much as simply stop being an airplane. There is no shoot. The strike package presses on to the target because that is the mission, and you fly the rest of that sortie with your hands doing the flying and the rest of you somewhere over the South China Sea already grieving. Back at the club that night, a captain who has been there longer than you raises a glass and says the thing everyone says. Doesn't count against the sortie total. He means, it happened. Move on. Nobody corrects him. You understand later that this too is a kind of fly the airplane, not the fear, worn down to its bones. 100 missions over North Vietnam ends a tour. A number, not a year, not a season, ticked off one red slash at a time on a chart taped inside your locker. Every pilot on that base can tell you his count before he can tell you the date. Your father's war never had to invent arithmetic like that. By Mission 20 you have flown Ton Hoa, the bridge the intelligence officers call the Dragon's Jaw, hit so many times by so many strike packages that the steel is scarred like a boxer's face and still, somehow, standing. Flak looks almost pretty at a distance. You have learned, black puffs blooming silently below you like something a child would draw, and the pretty ones are the ones that missed. You have learned to eat a full breakfast before every mission because Preacher told you a hungry pilot makes small mistakes, and small mistakes over Pack 6 are not small. You have learned Danny's boy's name before Danny's wife has even had the baby, because Danny says it on every walk to the jets, over and over. A promise made in advance. Mission 43 belongs to Preacher. He is leading a flak suppression flight over a SAM site near Kep, first in and last out. The job nobody wants and everybody respects. When a battery he was sent to silence gets there first. His wingman sees the shoot. That is the mercy of it. A shoot, a chance, and for 3 days the squadron does not know if Hollis Beckett is alive in a jungle, a cell, or nowhere at all. The not knowing sits over the whole base like weather. On the 4th day, word filters back through channels that do not officially exist. He is alive. He is a guest, the euphemism goes, of the HOA Low Prison in downtown Hanoi, a place the pilots have already started calling the Hanoi Hilton, with the particular black humor of men trying to survive a fact by joking about it. 26 years old and standing in the ready room, hearing his name read off a list of the missing, you feel younger than that. For the first time since Takhli, the 6 words don't work. You say them to yourself on the walk to your jet the next morning and they just hang there, empty as a locker. A replacement pilot corners you at the club not long after, 23 years old, boots still parade ground black, asking how you keep your hands from shaking on the run-in. Numbers climb by then, 50, 60, 71, the way blood climbs a thermometer, and somewhere in there, without quite noticing when, you have stopped being the new guy. You hear Preacher's voice come out of your own mouth before you've decided to say anything at all. Fly the airplane, not the fear. Eat before you fly. Trust the wingman on your right more than the voice in your own head. It is Hollis Beckett's war, still being flown, out of a cockpit he is no longer sitting in. That is how the missing stay present in a war. They speak through whoever is left, and the ones left rarely notice the borrowed voice. Routine is the word brief for Mission 97, a strike on a rail yard south of the ridge, low threat, right up until the day it isn't. Danny is on your wing. The SAM comes up out of nowhere the radar gear should have caught and doesn't, a bad tone that arrives half a second too late. His jet takes it dead center and comes apart in a way that leaves no time for a shoot and no room for an argument with anyone about fairness. Some part of your training makes you circle the smoke once. You key the MIC and say his boy's name into the radio, once, quietly, the way a man delivers something he has been asked to carry. 3 missions. He had 3 missions left, a chisel in his G-soap pocket, and a rocking chair sitting half-finished on a workbench in Thailand that a squadron mate will crate up and ship home without being asked. 9 days later, the 100th mission arrives, alone, in the way every Thud pilot flies alone, tucked into a formation of men all counting their own private numbers. There is no fanfare in the cockpit. A red line gets drawn through the last box on a chart. A bar gets bought for the whole squadron that night. Someone snaps a photograph of you standing in front of your jet holding up 10 fingers, 10 missions short of nothing, 100 fingers if you'd had them. You fly home the way your war does it, a commercial contract jet out of Bangkok, stewardesses, a hot meal on a tray, 20 hours from a war to a driveway. Your father crossed an ocean by ship after his war and had a month to become a civilian again, one wave at a time. You get a layover in Anchorage and a bag of peanuts. Home has not waited for you. Carol has finished her 2nd year of teaching. Denise has a driver's license and a boyfriend your father does not fully approve of. The house on Maple with the crooked porch is still for sale, patient, as if it knew. Your hands, which flew a fighter bomber through the most defended airspace in the history of warfare, will not hold a hammer steady the first few times you try to fix that porch. Carol learns not to ask why. She learns to hand you the level and let the work be the conversation. Some nights you sit on the unfinished porch steps and she sits beside you without a word for an hour at a time. Nobody will ever put a medal on that hour, but it is where half your war gets fought, on a porch in Kansas, by a woman who never once climbed into a cockpit. 11 months passed before you touch the coin again. You cannot explain, even to yourself, why holding it feels like admitting something is finished. Carol finds it while putting away laundry, and she does not ask what it is. She asks who gave it to you. So you tell her, not everything, never everything, but Torres over Thud Ridge, preaches 6 words, and a rocking chair with a name already chosen for a boy whose father never got to teach him to use the chisel. She listens without once telling you it wasn't your fault, which is the only reason you can keep talking at all. When you finish, she is quiet. Then she says 3 words. Finish the porch. Spring brings the wedding, on the porch you finished. At the reception, in front of both families, the band plays one slow number before the fast ones start. You and Carol dance to it alone for the first 8 bars before anyone else steps out. 5 words spoken in a doorway a year and a half earlier finally get to mean what they were always going to mean. Kept, late, the way the important promises usually are. February of 1973 puts you in front of a television, 28 years old, Carol beside you and your infant daughter on your hip, watching grainy footage from Takhli Air Base in the Philippines. Operation Homecoming, the anchor calls it, American prisoners of war coming down the ramp of a C-141 one at a time, gaunt men in ill-fitting civilian clothes squinting into daylight they have not stood in for years. The names scroll at the bottom of the screen. You watch every one. On the 3rd day of broadcast, a name comes up that stops the room. Beckett Hollis R. Lieutenant Colonel. He walks down that ramp on his own power, thinner than the man who taught you 6 words on a flight line in Thailand. He stops at the bottom and salutes the flag before he does anything else, before he even looks for whoever came to meet him. You fly to Texas the following month, uninvited, unannounced, and find him at a VA facility sitting by a window. You do not say hello first. You reach into your pocket and set a silver $50 down on the table in front of him. The nick in the eagle's wing worn smoother now by your own thumb the way it was once worn smooth by your father's. I don't need it anymore, you tell him, a lie and the truth at the same time, the way the 6 words always were. He looks at the coin for a long time. Then he gives you the rest of the philosophy, the part he never had the chance to finish on a flight line in 1966. It was never about the airplane, he says. It was about flying it anyway. That's the whole trick. There never was a way to not be afraid. Years go by the way they do. You finish your career flying trainers stateside, teaching 22-year-olds the same 6 words in the same flat voice preacher used on you, never telling them where the words came from until they've earned a right to ask. A photograph of a rocking chair sits on the mantel at home. Your son grows up with no reason to know its name, until one Christmas, when you finally tell him about Danny Vokes and a boy in Oregon who is, by then, 30-some years old himself with children of his own. Quietly, you learn the chair made it home after all, crated, unfinished, one spindle short, and that Danny's son keeps it in a nursery today, the last thing his father's hands ever built. Dayton, Ohio is where 2003 finds you, driving in with your grown children and grandchildren to the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where an F-105 Thunderchief sits under fluorescent light. A placard lists its wing, its base, its dates of service. None of the missions it flew written anywhere, because there wasn't room on a placard for 100 numbers. You stand in front of that airplane for a long time. Your grandson, 7 years old, asks what it was like. You answer him honestly, for the first time in 37 years, because you have learned by now exactly what silence costs a family when it goes unspoken too long. Then you reach into your coat. You press a silver $50 into his small hand, the nick worn down now by 3 generations of thumbs, and close his fingers around it the way your father once closed yours in a Kansas parking lot. You do not explain the rest yet. He will ask again someday. You will answer. For years you told yourself the fear never fully left the cockpit with you. Standing in that museum under the belly of the airplane that carried you through 100 missions and back, you finally understand what Preacher meant, all those years too late to tell him you finally got it. The fear was never supposed to leave. It rode in the seat with you every single time, uninvited, unpaid, unremovable, and you flew the airplane anyway, mission after mission after mission. That was never a contradiction. That was the whole job, not the absence of fear. The presence of it, carried, and flown through regardless. Hand in hand with your grandson, you walk out of the museum into the ordinary Ohio daylight, past 100 other airplanes that carried 100 other men through 100 other fears. Somewhere behind you, mounted under glass, a Thunderchief keeps sitting exactly where it's supposed to, done with its missions, counting nothing anymore, at rest.